Hey everybody, welcome students. Steve here with Jennifer Bazar from the History of Psychology Museum. I was actually thinking we probably want a tagline for the museum at the end of every last audio or something
Oh, I
to
love that.
something like that. We'll think it. So the idea here today is just to kind of introduce you guys to your activity a little bit. Especially the history of psychology side of things with the History of Psychology Museum. Jennifer is the curator there. Is that your proper
No, I'm
title?
actually the assistant director there.
Assistant director. All
Yeah.
right. Fantastic. And she's already been helping with this activity in a bunch of different ways. So actually, I like to just start by kind of putting you back in your student world a little bit and seeing if you'll tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to be where you are today?
Well, I actually love that you frame it as if I've left my student world. I very much have adopted the philosophy that I am a lifelong learner. And like quite literally, like I continually take courses and classes wherever I can find them. It's something that I never wanted to leave. But my journey, it's sort of one of those maybe perhaps somewhat classic story in terms of I was doing my undergraduate degree at Bishop's University in psychology. And I did my honors thesis. I thought I was going to do experimental research. And so it was kind of a classic little research study that I did. And I enjoyed it, but what happened was sort of the lovely thing that we hope that happens to a lot of people is I fell in love with the courses that a particular faculty member taught. So Dr. Dale Stout taught a lot of courses in the psychology department at Bishop's, and every course he taught from a historical perspective. So not just the history of psychology courses, which I just ate up. I loved it. And I had never been a history person. I hated history. It was not my thing. But everything else, whether it was social psychology or, behavioral psychology or like whatever it was, he started with the history. He sort of engaged us that way. And I liked the questions that he raised. I was interested in the articles he had us reading, the problems that sort of, came out of all of this. And so when I was graduating, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I really was kind of at a loss. My initial vision was no longer there. I wasn't interested in being in a laboratory the way I thought I was going to be. And so I sat down in his office and I said, I love your classes. I really do. Like, I don't know what that means, but this is what I like. So what could I do with that? Like, where could this take me? And he very calmly sat there and said, well, there's a history of psychology program out of York University. And, one of my former students is currently the coordinator. Let me email him for you. And it was just sort of one of those great circumstances where, I kind of got an introduction to Christopher Green, who's still it's now the history and theory and I think they've added critical psychology to the title up at York University. It's one of they've got several areas like every school does within the psych department. And so after a few back and forths about what this might look like, I applied and I did both my master's and my PhD there with Chris Green actually as my supervisor. Um,
Oh, Chris,
and
he's a
yeah,
smart dude. Smart dude.
some great work that he does, excellent work. Learned just an amazing amount from him. And, it's one of those programs where every student works on different topics. So, kind of untraditional from, a psychology laboratory where often, students all within the same lab will do similar work to what their supervisor does. We all did radically different things. So I ended up doing asylum history. So my major area of research is within psychiatric institutionalization. And it all started from Chris handing me a book. It was, oh gosh, what's it called? Something of Patients Past, Remembrances of Patients Past by Jeffrey Rayom, who Toronto-based as well, all about the history of the Toronto Asylum from using the archival collection from a patient's perspective. And so it led me down to the archives at CAMH, and it's kind of all ballooned from there. And it was just, I couldn't get enough of it. Every day I had new questions. It just made me curious. And that was my desire in life, was to find some sort of employment that made me curious, that made me want to, kind of get up in the morning and keep going, as opposed to something that kind of droned on. Like I didn't want to be bored. I didn't want, I wanted something that challenged me. I just didn't know what that looked like. And somehow it became a history of psychology. um,
Fantastic.
Yeah, and
So
so, for a long time I taught, sort of the classic academic route. I was doing my research, I taught on the side, taught contracts all over, and eventually landed in a postdoc up with partially with the University of Toronto, and then hosted with the Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care up in Penetanguishene.
okay.
And my job there was actually to create a digital exhibit about their forensic mental health program because they were demolishing the old building. And that's what launched me into museums. I had already been working with objects as part of my dissertation research, and then like actually creating an exhibit. I ended up doing some stuff on site, some tours, creating an online archive of their materials, that kind of thing. That's kind of what led me down the branch that I ended up following. So I've always stayed connected to educational institutions. I mean, my previous position was working out of Humber College. I'm now connected with the University of Akron. But it's been with this sort of the public outreach side, what I call public history, right? Like, how do you bring history kind of outside of the classroom and yet still working within the classroom as well, which I quite enjoy. So it's, best of all worlds. Yeah.
Excellent. So, I mean, a few things I just want to mention. First of all, just sort of to the students, that idea of sort of finding something that you resonate with, and even to the point, like I love in your story where you knew what you liked, you just didn't know where to go with that, and that willingness to kind of say, oh, here's a potential direction. Let me look into that. I love how you're modeling History Geek, by the way. One of the things I always tell to instructors in general is wear your geek on your sleeve. If you think something is really cool, wear it. And you seem to think history of psychology is really cool.
I think if you're a historian of psychology, you just got to embrace it. And it's sort of one of those, like, if you follow your passion, you're going to end up sharing it regardless. It's like honorary geek status immediately. So you can't get away from it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. I hope that'll kind of help. I mean, the other thing I think I want people to think about in your story was the opportunity. So the opportunity in Penetanguishene to do this thing you've never done before, probably, in the sense of putting the show together, and how kind of embracing that, which had to be a challenge. So we'll get into critical
Oh,
thinking.
yeah.
Thinking, you had to probably think, how do I do this well, and what is it they're looking for, and etc. But then having gone through that, for it to kind of shape your direction and say, oh, that was kind of fun and interesting. I'm a big fan of following opportunities, and sometimes they go nowhere,
Mhm.
but sometimes they really take you to a place you'd never be otherwise. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's actually the other key element here that I would recommend is, I had a vision, right? Like, I mean, back when I was, getting into university and stuff about what I might do, and it's not where I am, and yet I really wouldn't change the choices I made. I think it's about flexibility and allowing yourself to follow something you didn't expect,
yeah,
and allowing that pathway to kind of form around you.
yeah. And I went to university to be a music producer.
There
Somehow
you go.
ended up here. But it'd be the same, almost the sort of same story. And right down to, by the way, having a professor that had a major impact where, taking Professor Wayne Donaldson's courses, in my case, and just resonating with that empirical kind of psychology really changed my course in a very positive way. So again, I wouldn't trade a thing either. So fantastic. Let's talk about your job now a little bit. I go on with my students, and they'll tell you about critical thinking, creative thinking,
Mhm.
communication, collaboration, and I talk about how these skills are things that are so important once they leave university. Let me just ask this sort of fun question. How much of what you do that's important do you do all by yourself?
Yeah, so little. um, so, I mean, so in my current role, so I'm the assistant director of the Cummings Center for the History of Psychology. And with that, like, one of my major roles is really being the content expert for our projects. And so I am a trained historian of psychology. That's sort of my, established field. And I work with a group of, specialized archivists, librarians, educators. I mean, people who all have a really rich skill set that all combine to make what we do. And so I bring in some of that content. So, I mean, there are elements, I suppose, in terms of, I do individual research to some extent, digging through our collection, the archival papers, background reading, secondary sources, that kind of thing. I mean, that I need to be informed to do my portion of the group work. But everything we create, whether it's an educational activity or resource, something within the museum, a temporary exhibit, any of the videos we do, even our social media. All of that is a collaborative project. And I work with different people, sort of within the center, depending on who all needs to be on the project at any given time. Like, so it really is often teamwork, basically collaborative teamwork that, you each have an individual role in, but it's part of the collective whole.
Yeah, I mean that's I just harp about that so much because literally nothing I've done, I don't think I've done on my own. And being able, getting to the point where you're at. I mean, I don't know how well we remember how awkward it was when we were in university to be put in with a set of strangers. And one of the things I ask my students is try not to go into a group with friends. That's their first
Mm-hmm.
tendency. They all want
Yeah.
to jump into a group, and I say, no, no, this is your opportunity to be with three strangers,
Mm-hmm.
to try to interact with them and learn those human skills. And especially if one of them perhaps is not doing what they should be, to
Yeah.
learn
How do you troubleshoot that?
yeah, how do you troubleshoot? And,
Yeah.
and that's sort of what group work is about. Like some of the things that students dislike about group work is the point of group work. It
Yep.
is the fact that, yeah, so every now and then you have somebody that you have to kind of find a way to motivate or threaten or or whatever. And of course, there's always, in our case, a peer evaluation step after where they all assess each other's impact. So there's the ability to kind of do that. But the reason we do all that is because you will find yourself in a room with a bunch of colleagues with different skill sets trying to do something cool together.
Well,
And
it's also like on another angle, an excellent way to practice networking. If you think about it from that side, like, I mean, there is definitely the collaborative side of things, but networking is so key and yet really painful sometimes, especially when you're starting out. Like if you walk into, a project and you're kind of the new person, or you walk into a conference and you're the new person. I mean, these are people who could down the road help you with a job or help you with a grant or a project or, whatever it might be. So how do you start those conversations? How do you demonstrate your skill set? How do you work with somebody on what they're doing, sort of as like these relationship building aspects? And I think the more opportunities you can practice that, the easier it starts to make it.
I agree completely. And I think that's an important thing to mention to students. You might see people who've been in the game a little longer who seem perfectly comfortable networking. I guarantee you, none of us are.
No,
In a
no.
room full of people we don't know, we feel just like you do stepping into that room and going, oh my goodness, I have to try to make the most of it. You can learn some strategies. You can learn. I sometimes throw out the old Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People from the
Oh,
19th.
yeah.
There's
Great
so
choice.
many tips there about just how to get a conversation going, how to sort of get it going on the right footstep. And really, if you learn some of those, and this is the context for learning them when you're working with groups and doing stuff, they don't make the anxiety go away, but they make it go away by about halfway through the
Yeah.
experience. Once
Yeah.
you're into there and you have some conversations going, then you're like, okay, cool.
Mhm.
But know that anxiety is normal in those situations.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it becomes, that network, I think helps to build kind of, so that when you do walk into those spaces, you end up not being entirely alone, right? You start to get to know people in the field and, not necessarily even within your own organization or your own city, right? It starts to expand out from that, which, kind of makes the world a little smaller, which of course some of this digital communication does as well.
And then you have the next dilemma that many of us have. You walk into a room and you see a table of people you know and a bunch of people you don't know. And you're
Ah.
drawn irresistibly to the people you know because they're
Yeah.
familiar and warm and comfy.
Mhm.
And to learn to go, no, I'm going to go the other way.
Yep.
I'm going to go hang out with some because every person there is a potential opportunity, just as you say. And getting to know them opens doors. And
Mhm.
so, very much, it's about at your stage for
Mhm.
you guys having as many doors open as possible by the time you graduate. And so that if one of them suddenly lights you up at some point, like we've heard about with Jennifer, that door is open. And the fact that her professor was willing to help her like that, I imagine you had gone to office hours or something, you'd gotten
Yep.
to know this person relatively well, and that opens the door.
And I do think, I mean, the part, when I talk about my trajectory in my career, it sounds like, oh, you just sort of went from degree to degree and positions appeared. It was through networking. I mean, quite, even within the education side, talking to my professor, him recommending a program and a specific person to reach out to see whether or not it did fit what I wanted to do. Within my job search, whether it was contract work while I was a grad student, the postdoc afterwards, additional research contracts, my eventual positions that I've held in the years since, it's all been through word of mouth, network, and not that that's how you get the position, but it's, somebody sends you that message like, hey, you're working on something that would be perfect for this role. You should apply for it. Or there's an opportunity coming up that, you should get involved in. Like those kinds of things create your career. It's not, and unfortunately, I mean, it's such a tight market, regardless of what area you go into, that, how do you stand out? Well, it is through networking. If you're going to be one of 500 applications that came in, it does help if you can, kind of tailor these things a little bit to what is going to be the project. Or if you've already worked with the person, it might get your foot in the door for an interview at least.
Absolutely. Cool, cool. Okay, let's maybe shift to the actual
Sure.
purpose of this all. I love this humanization stage because I think it's really important for students to kind of get to know you. So our goal here, this is a history of psychology course,
Mhm.
uh, and I sometimes feel like you really appreciate history when you try to write it, when you try to,
Yeah.
create it. First of all, it feels very intimidating, right? Because there's this feeling of accuracy, obviously, that certain things did happen in a certain way. And if you're going to tell that story, you want to be as close to the right story and including the right people and not. And so you'll learn the great challenge of trying to tell a story of a discipline. The idea, what we're going to try to do in this project is kind of take this big history of psychology course and give you guys a taste of what it's like to tell a smaller history of psychology. So specifically, we found 6 different areas of psychology. You're going to be able to pick one, and working with others, 3 other people, you're going to try to tell that story across 7 short audio clips, I guess, using that treble system that I talk about on this other video. We have another video like this with Armel. He'll talk to you about that. And so Jennifer's willing to help. So first of all, she's had a bunch of resources she's sent to us that when you're looking at this video, they're probably right on this page with you as well. So that can get some of you started. But in addition, she's given us a link to a tour of the History of Psychology Museum, the Cummings History of Psychology Museum. So you should go through that and just use it to motivate you, if nothing else, kind of give you that sort of geekiness that, that Jennifer has so much. Take a little bit of that in with you and just try to tell the story well, because where we're going to try to fit here is, yeah, you can have the Cummings Museum, and obviously certain people know about that and go to that, but the people who go to Treble might not have found that otherwise. And maybe we now have an opportunity to bring psychology to the masses, let them have a better understanding of some of the different kinds of psychology there are and how they evolved. And that's the kind of goal here. So I don't know. What are your thoughts? Let me just get your thoughts, Jennifer, on what we're planning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting challenge too, right? Because I mean, one is you are trying to create content for a public audience, which is something that really interests me, right? So I think the public is inherently always interested in psychology. They read about it constantly, right? It's always in the news in various ways, but it's also about them. Right. So we all want to know more stuff about us and about our friends and about our family and to understand ourselves. I mean, that's why intro psychology courses are so popular, even across non-psychology disciplines. And so I do think that there's already kind of that intrigue. And so you can play on that. And I think that there's a way then, how do you talk about these topics? Because you're not going to be able to summarize. I mean, these are big topics, right? So you can't summarize everything. What are some of the key elements that would help somebody be interested in the history of that area? Might want to learn more, or might at least, kind of sort of save it in their brain for information at a trivia night later. I don't know. But this is also your comment, Steve, about critical thinking.
Yep.
That I think will be really key here, because you have to make choices about what's going to be included in this very short, recording, about what's included, what's not included, how it's presented. And I would pose an extra challenge to your students to say, the textbook will present it one way. But textbooks, in all areas of psychology, but certainly history of psychology, have gotten a lot of criticism lately because it is traditionally the white male American story. Right. And that's it, right? If you see any women or BIPOC populations in there, they might be relegated to the box, right? They get the sidebar on the page or the chapter or whatever. And yet it ignores a huge proportion of the population that was contributing to the development of each of these fields. And so maybe flip the story on its head a little bit. Sort of look at it from a bit of a different perspective, or even just highlight where we're sort of missing some voices, or who's being who are actually making up the what do you call it, the participant pools that are sort of
Yeah.
shaping what we think of as kind of the results that we all go off of. Well, it's a very particular population.
Not
um,
quite a random sample, not really.
Not quite random.
Yeah, we use
Yeah.
Benjafield, and Benjafield does, at least in the most, well, the version we have, he at least is trying to highlight the contributions of others to
Oh,
some
for
extent.
sure. Yeah.
At least makes a tip towards it. But I think your point still holds. There's probably a lot more to do there. And by the way, I'm going to do, this is a nasty thing. I don't know what your thoughts are, but students love like clear rubrics. Like what exactly should be in these seven,
Ah.
and I don't like to always give them,
Mm.
especially when it's a creative thing like this. Like I don't know what the best journey will look like. What we're actually going to do is within each of these subfields, there may be five or six or seven of you groups creating that history. And then we're going to ask you guys to assess each other's creations at the end. We're going to create a rubric, and I'm going to create it. I'm going to create it first, and I'm going to pass it by Jennifer, and I'm going to get her reaction. And we're going to try to capture, what is it we're looking for. So we'll try to capture that in a rubric, but it's going to be, around accuracy, obviously, but also around engagement, I think, and really thinking about this target market of, imagine just some random person is starting to listen to your tape or your acoustic. I always have trouble talking about what these things are, audio clips, I guess. So what is it? How are you going to grab them? And then how well do you tell the story? I think that's going to be part of it. Will they want to be waiting to hear that next part? Check out the Zygarnik effect, by the way. You might want to use that a little bit in some of your videos to have them hanging on for that next audio one that's coming out
Mm.
tomorrow. So we're going to come up with a rubric, but outside of that rubric, it's going to be largely your creativity, and I don't want you to be too harnessed by some roadmap, and I don't think we could even create one
Mm.
anyway. I mean, that's to Jennifer's point. You could tell the history of psychology probably as many ways as you have different authors, and there's not really a right way. There's probably some bad ways. There's probably some wrong things to do, but generally it's sort of finding that, thinking of your market, and then trying to convince them that this is really cool,
Mhm.
and they would be really interested in this. And as Jennifer said, psychology is cool. It's got that, if you think about it well enough and you choose some of the right examples along the way, you can grab somebody's mind, pretty quickly. I like to teach intro psych too, because I call it the greatest hits of psychology. And so
Oh, it
it's,
totally is. Yeah.
you get the greatest hits, it's even easier. So you guys can do that, but within the areas. So yeah, I mean,
If I could add one thing that might help there is if you're thinking about it, sometimes people go into like, oh, it's history. So it's
yeah,
got to have a timeline and a whole bunch of dates, and I got to name the right people. I would say throw that out the window. I mean, you
yeah.
certainly need a little bit of, some mention of some of this, kind of information along the way, but I wouldn't let it guide the story. Like what are the questions that you ask about a particular area? What do you think people might be interested in or misunderstand about what is social psychology, or what is developmental psychology, or what is clinical psychology? Because there's a lot, think about the stereotypes, right? Like clinical is a great one because there'll be a lot of assumptions made that then overlap in, a psychiatry. So like, what are those differences? How did psychology develop differently? How has it changed over time so that there is much more alignment between those two disciplines? And using those questions to direct your content, I think, helps to choose then the examples that you might want to involve, rather than thinking about it as a timeline. Like, okay, what's the first? Looking for the first. No one cares about the first. It's about like what helps to tell that story in an interesting way that is going to, in those short moments, will
Yeah.
get somebody to want to learn a little bit more and listen to that next recording. And
I can tell my students' brains are going, oh, all this ambiguity. What do I do with it? Let me also assure my students that we have our exams, and the exams are probably the tough part in the course in terms of the grade, because there's so much to learn in a history of psychology course. These activities are meant to be more about the learning than about assessing you guys in any tough sort of way. And so what we're looking for you is just go through this with the right spirit. try your best, put in a good effort. And if you do that, we're not looking to kill you with grades here. What we really want to do is sort of set you loose and get you kind of having fun with this and experiencing the material in that sort of different way. I'll let you know, within each of these areas, you guys are going to assess each other. That's going to get us the top two within each area. And Jennifer has very kindly, and with a significant amount of time commitment, I should say, because consider each of these is 21 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes really by the time we do the 7. And there's 6 areas, 2 within each area, so that's 12 times 20 minutes is, I don't know, something like 3 or 4 hours, or 3 hours of Jennifer's time that it would take to watch these 2. But she's going to pick the best one of those.
Just one?
Just one of
now I feel pressure.
Yeah, just one of each 2. Because then we're going to end up with 6 ultimate journeys that we're going to stitch all together. And so ultimately, imagine somebody's jogging and listening to treble. They could go for a month and a half learning all about the history of psychology across these sort of audio clips, which is kind of cool. So yeah, I mean, Jennifer's going to have eyes on. So that's why we will kind of try to work up a rubric that is as clear as we can tell it. But it's going to say things like was very engaging, drew the person in, and rather than saying had 8 historical figures cited or something like that. It's not going to be that sort of checkbox rubric. It'll be much more of a, what's the sort of feel we're going for? You sometimes hear this with this is going to be nasty. No, I don't even know if I should say it. I'm going to say it anyway. You see it when you hear singers or songwriters or dancers and there's a choreographer and they'll say things like, you have to make me feel something. And they'll tell a bunch of technically correct people, you're doing it technically correct, but I'm not feeling that. We want to feel that. We want to feel that geekiness. We want to feel that, you think this is cool and therefore the listener should think it's cool. We're going to be looking for that sort of, I don't know, hard to describe coolness to what your work does as well. We will try to be as clear as we can. But again, largely this is going to be taking off the handcuffs and saying, do something. Make something really cool. Kind of like imagine Jennifer having to go and do this, show in Penetanguishene where it's like, I don't know exactly what they want, but I'm a smart person. I know my stuff. I'm going to do something that I think would be a really good thing that I would enjoy, and that would capture me. I think that's the best mindset to have. Cool.
Absolutely. I follow your own interests, because if you're interested, then your listener, you're not going to grab every listener always, but you're going to grab a good, cross section of listeners who are equally kind of curious and want to know more.